My name's Maria Takalanda and I'm a member of a poetry research group here at Deakin University. And our research group is looking at the ways in which poetry retains an important place in public culture. And I'm here today with two other members of that poetry research group, David McCooey and Cassandra Atherton.
And one of the things I'm interested in is the way in which poetry operates in what you, I suppose, call extra poetic contexts. So poetry working in places where you wouldn't expect it necessarily. And one of the things I've written about recently is the relationship between poetry and terrorism, which might seem like a very unexpected connection, but there have been a number of examples in recent times where those two things come together. Recently there was an anthology of poetry published by inmates of Guantanamo Bay, no less. There was a case in the UK concerning a blogger who called herself the Lyrical Terrorist, and she ended up being the first woman in the UK to be charged under anti-terrorism law there. And also, in particular, an interesting example of poetry appearing in this kind of extra poetic context is Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, who at his execution made no verbal statement, but for his he presented a written statement which basically was quoting a 19th century poem by W.E. Henley called Invictus. And that use of that poem in that way I think is very interesting because it raises questions about what is poetry, how do various uses of poetry change our ideas about poetry and so forth.
Yeah, and that feeds a little bit into what I'm doing as well. I've started looking at some American poets. Adrienne Rich talks a lot about the terrorism in the US. She talks a lot about waterboarding and torture that's going on and comments on it in her poetry. So reading her poetry is really interesting sort of through that facet. I'm also interested in the poet as a public intellectual, so not just the poet in the world, but the poet commenting on the world. And I did a series of interviews. Probably the most interesting one for me in regards to the poetry and research group was Dana Joyer, who is a poet and a critic, but also the former chairman for the National Endowment for the Arts. And he talks about how poetry can make changes in the world, and he was responsible, for example, for something like the Big Read, which got students actively involved in reading classics and reading books to enrich their sort of lives. But poetry can be political, and I think it's bound up with lots of ideas of the political.
And there does seem to be some intrinsic connection between poetry and experiences or emotions of extremity. So we see that with the examples of poetry outpourings in response to the terrorist acts, for instance. But poetry appears routinely at funerals, at weddings. It's something that we seem to turn to automatically, unconsciously, in order to express these extreme experiences of loss or of love.
Yeah. And a good example of that, actually, talking of outpourings after terrorist experiences, is just after 9/11. There was this massive, popular and
heartfelt.
Yes, outpouring of poetry by ordinary people posting poems on lampposts and having poetry readings, and suddenly W.H. Auden's poem September 1939 became this kind of public statement and was being used, it was being read over the radio and at poetry readings and so forth. So poetry can have very much, I think, a surprising public presence at times of crisis.
Yeah.
And in fact, in terms of that example of the Big Read too, another interesting project in the US was Robert Pinsky organising something called the Favourite Poem Project, in which ordinary people would read their favourite poems to camera, and they produced this massive database of people reading their favourite poems. So there clearly has been a concerted effort in the US at least to see poetry continue as this kind of public discourse.
Language of the people.
Yeah.
So we've talked about poetry as being a kind of language that we turn to express emotions that are extreme, that are difficult to talk about, and that's certainly consistent with my experience of writing poetry. So we often turn to poetry to write about experiences of love or loss, but there are also other experiences that seem resistant to normal or everyday articulation. So that might be the experience of someone else's subjectivity, the experience of the strangeness of history, the experience of the environment. And the poem that I'm going to read, I suppose, attempts to explore one's experience of the environment, something that's quite sort of ineffable or difficult to articulate. And it's called Geography Lessons. How a mountain can forsake you for the sky, casting away your heart like a goat kicking at a brittle stone. How a forest can feed you with its air, tenuous fusion of night and day, until you think it might be enough. How a river can feel small and dangerous, calling you by your secret name, the one only your mirror knows. How an ocean can rage at the moon until you adopt its colossal anger as your own and live believing it is all something personal.
I'm interested in the sort of contemporary intellectual concerns in poetry, and so the poem that I'm going to read is by Adrienne Rich, who I mentioned before. She's a well-known poet and she's a well-known public intellectual in my opinion. She actually in 1997 refused the National Medal of the Arts because she felt that the administration was too cynical and she didn't agree with a lot of their politics. The poem that I'm going to read is about the US denials of torture, I suppose, so even though it was written in 2007, it's still really relevant today. And it's called Tonight No Poetry Will Serve. Saw you walking barefoot, taking a long look at the new moon's eyelid. Later, spread, sleep-fallen, naked in your hair. Asleep, but not oblivious of the unslept, unsleeping elsewhere. Tonight, I think, no poetry will serve. Syntax of rendition, verb pilots the plane, adverb modifies action. Verb force feeds noun, submerges the subject, noun is choking. Verb, disgraced, goes on doing. Now diagram the sentence.
I'm going to be reading a couple of stanzas from a 19th century poem called Invictus by W.E. Henley. Invictus had a kind of interesting afterlife, I suppose. It was the favourite poem of Nelson Mandela when he was imprisoned by the South African government. He used it as a kind of inspirational text for himself and his fellow prisoners. It's also more bizarrely being used in an advertisement for a gun-mounted flashlight, and it has had a number of other people kind of take it on, and I suppose most famously in recent years it's been Timothy McVeigh, who, as I said, used it as his final written statement for his execution. And the poem, I'll read the beginning and the ending of the poem. It starts, "Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul." And those last two lines, of course, are very famous, coming from someone like Timothy McVeigh, who caused the deaths of 168 people, including a good many children. That, of course, is quite an extraordinary kind of statement to be making just prior to your execution. It's a really provocative kind of statement to be making, in fact. And the fact that he used a poem that was so well known, I think, is quite an interesting feature of his act.
I hope we've given you some insight into poetry as research. I know that both of those terms seem to be exclusive, but I hope after hearing us talk about it that you'll see that they go hand in hand.